Today is going to be a little different from the previous 2 weeks. Not very different, but a little. For the past 2 weeks, I've given a short lecture in the first half, and then we've done an activity in the second half. This week, I'll have a short lecture in the first half, but in the second half, a slightly longer one, and probably no time for an activity. But that's the only time that's going to happen. Last week, the speech that we watched was Emily Trader, and I realized after class ended, there's a detail that I did not explain very clearly. 2 weeks ago, we watched the speech by Kevin King. Kevin King was competing in informative speaking. In informative speaking, the object of the game, the contest, is to tell the audience about something they didn't know before and why it's important. But when you do informative speaking, you don't tell them what to do about it. If you do tell them what they should do, the judges will score you very low if it's informative speaking. Now, Emily was the 2019 national champion of persuasive speaking. And in persuasive speaking, the judges want to see the speaker tell the audience what to do. So the speaker should identify a problem, usually analyze the cause of the problem, and then explain how we can solve the problem. So they were two different speaking events. That becomes important for some of the questions that you asked, some of the things that you noticed that a Japanese speaker might not do. To begin with, she was very emotional, you pointed out. There was lots of emotion in her voice. She sounded like she was almost crying. And she was very emotional on her face. And many of you said a Japanese speaker would try not to be emotional, that they would try to be more like someone reading the news on television. Because that way, that's not distracting and it's more believable. Last week, or maybe the week before, I was explaining why they walk the way they do, why they walk the triangle. And I said, that's just something everybody who competes does. They all walk the triangle. Now, I bring that up because in persuasive speaking, at the highest level in the United States, they all have a moment during their speech when they become emotional. Very often they sound like they are about to cry. Sometimes they don't sound like they are about to cry, but they sound angry. That's something that is common and very well accepted by Western audiences. When a persuasive speech is being given, very often the speaker will sound emotional. Last week, in talking about how to begin a speech, I demonstrated for you the introduction to the speech I wrote 40 years ago when I was 14. And I don't know if you remember, but the tone I had in my voice was one of being afraid. And that's something persuasive speakers sometimes do. They try to make what they're talking about sound frightening. 2 weeks ago, we saw Kevin King speak about social engineering. Kevin King won the national championship in informative with that speech in 2015. In the same year, he also won persuasive speaking. I briefly mentioned last week that he began his speech by saying, of the top 10 causes of death in the United States, 9 are going down, 1 is going up. That 1 is Alzheimer's. And that was his speech, Alzheimer's, and what we could do to find a cure. In his third main point, he told the audience that because his father had died when he was young, he was raised by his grandfather. And then he took about a minute of the speech to tell the audience what it was like to watch his grandfather, after he was diagnosed with Alzheimer's, fade out of existence. And as Kevin was telling that, he came to the brink of tears and had tears in his eyes. And I noticed, because I watched the Persuasive finals, every other speaker in the finals had a moment where they either almost cried or got angry or sounded terrified. I say all that to say, when you talk to a Western audience, if your purpose is to change their behavior, you want to give them information about a problem that they need to address by changing their behavior, showing emotion in that speech. Not only is that accepted, it makes you more effective with a Western audience. So that is the first thing. Oh, a couple of more things to say. A little bit of the background to this behavior coming out of intercultural research. When cultures are classified, one way they are classified is neutral or affective. Neutral or affective. I think I remember from our first class meeting hearing that some of you had been to Europe. And if you were to visit Spain or Italy or Greece, or outside Europe, if you went to Central and South America, many of those cultures are very affective. Now, affective means they show their emotion. They don't feel emotion more, they show it. And they grow up, they are taught as children, it's okay to show your emotion. When something's funny, they laugh loudly. When they believe something very strongly, they may sound angry, they may yell, their face might turn red. And the person they're talking to knows they're not angry, they just believe something strongly. At the other end of the spectrum, neutral cultures, you are raised to believe that polite behavior is to not show your emotion, or to show the correct emotion for the situation, no matter what you really feel. Some countries with a neutral culture include most of Northern Europe, Finland, Sweden, Norway, England, and Japan. Japan is classified as very neutral. Now, the United States is moderately affective. Moderately affective. And I have had American students of mine do study abroad in places like Spain. And they get a little uncomfortable at people they've just met will burst out crying over something that went wrong that day. Because in the culture there, if you have an emotion, you show it. You don't cover it. So, all of that to say, if Japanese speakers try to avoid showing emotion while giving a speech, that's understandable in a neutral culture. Because the United States is moderately affective, in informative speeches, you're less likely to see strong emotion. And Kevin did not show strong emotion. But in persuasive speeches, strong emotion is common. One other thing to mention. Relational mobility. Relational mobility. A whole lot of data shows that in Japan and some other countries around the world, there is a pattern that your close relationships, most of them are formed when you are young. You make a set of friends while you are growing up, and those are your friends. And those friendships continue, and it's very difficult to make new friends. And countries where people report that that is true, they are categorized as low relational mobility. Now, the United States is high relational mobility. And what that means is it's not that unusual to move to a new job or a new city and make a completely new set of friends. It's a very common occurrence. I bring that up here to say, in higher relational mobility cultures, a stranger can say things to you that ordinarily you would think only a friend or family member should say. Someone you've never met can walk up to you and say something that's not necessarily correct or proper or polite. They can share with you that they are feeling powerful emotion about something. In the questions you've submitted, especially last week's questions about Kevin's speech, some of you said he picked out an audience member and he talked to her. We Japanese don't like it when someone we don't know begins talking to us. We want to be introduced and know someone before someone talks to us. Well, for Western audiences, being talked to by someone you've never met is normal, very ordinary. And that may in part explain why Emily can show such strong emotion to a room full of strangers, and they still give her the national championship for doing it. All right. A second thing that was pointed out in the questions, at the end, she gave a handout. She showed it, she set it down, she invited people to come take a copy or take a picture of it with their phone. And some of you, in the questions you submitted, you said, offering a handout is unusual. You would not see a Japanese speaker do that. Today, we are going to talk about PowerPoint, about slides, and the fact that she didn't show any slides and Kevin didn't show any slides. To answer this question, I want to elaborate on something I mentioned, I think, last week. Jeff Bezos, for a long time, was the world's wealthiest man, although I think Elon Musk is ahead of him and probably a few other people. But Jeff Bezos is a very successful businessman, founder, and he's no longer the CEO, but he is still in a position of leadership at Amazon. This is Jeff Bezos' policy. If you are invited to present at a meeting that he is in, first of all, no PowerPoint allowed. He will not sit through a PowerPoint. He has had that rule for more than 20 years. He hates PowerPoint. Instead, you are expected to make a 6-page memo. Take the content of your presentation and you have a 6-page limit. You then hand that out at the beginning of the meeting and you say nothing for 30 minutes. For 30 minutes, the people in the meeting, they read your memo. And when 30 minutes is up, then you begin presenting. So, handouts, using a handout when you give a presentation, I don't want you to think this happens all the time. But it does happen sometimes. It's not that unusual. And a handout, instead of slides, there is, in Western organizations, an understanding that slides poorly done make a presentation much worse. And Western audiences can be very quick to call presentation slides. They have an expression, death by PowerPoint. And if you show up with lots of words on your PowerPoint and you just read them, they will shake their heads and say, death by PowerPoint. So, handouts, not that unusual. One other thing I'll mention. In 2019, Emily Trader had handouts, and if you had available the other speakers in the final, they all had handouts. They all brought with them leaflets, brochures, pieces of paper you could take with you. Today, we're going to watch a speech from 2022. He doesn't have any handouts. He has a QR code for you to scan with your phone. It's still a handout, but it's not a paper handout in the room. So, at least in this competitive activity, technologically they are making progress. But he won't use slides either. All right. A third thing pointed out in the questions was that her voice had a lower pitch. And the question went on to say that with Japanese speakers, the feminine ideal, a Japanese woman giving a speech, should have a very high-pitched voice. And I've noticed not only announcer voices to me, like the recorded voices on the train or voices on commercials, sound very high. Octaves higher than women's voices commonly would sound in the United States, the women who would be hired as announcers. So I think that's right, that a higher pitch in Japan might be the feminine ideal. One other thing I should say, I went back and listened to her again. Her voice doesn't sound low to me. It sounds like a very normal, mid-range young woman's voice. The questioner, one of the questioners said, in Japan, the exception is women in government. That women in positions of leadership, especially politics, they are encouraged to lower the pitch of their voice. And what I wanted to point out was that Margaret Thatcher is very well known for having sought out coaching and lessons in how to lower the pitch of her voice before she first ran for Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. And you can find YouTube videos from the first few years of her career when she was just a member of Parliament, and her voice is very high. And then you can find speeches after she was elected Prime Minister, and it has dropped a lot. So, probably if we dug into the data, we could explain in more detail why, but I think it is a simple and pretty accurate observation. Female speakers in positions of leadership, especially in politics, a slightly lower pitch. I don't know that it makes them more effective, but I think it is expected. And I think it can change the impression the audience has of whether the speaker is a good leader. All right. A questioner pointed out that Emily used lots of hand gestures. So I teach a class in nonverbal communication. I taught it at Gaidai last fall. And there's a whole unit about nonverbals involving body movement. And there's a whole category of gestures I'm going to use as an example when I demonstrate visual aids. What she's using are illustrator gestures. And what the data show is that when a speaker is doing what we called extemporaneous delivery, when you know the explanation, but you choose the words while talking, gestures help. The speaker gestures not necessarily for the audience, but to help the speaker form the words. Have you ever noticed that while you talk on the phone and the other person can't see you, you still gesture? We have experimentally asked people to explain complicated concepts while they sat on their hands. And they struggle to find the word they want. They stumble over words more. And if they then get to explain a second complicated concept, but gesture while doing it, the words come more easily. It's also true that when audience members can see gestures, they find it easier to decode the speaker's words. If an audience can't see the speaker's gesture, there are more misunderstandings, and they also have a harder time remembering the message later on. So yes, she gestured a lot. That's very common with Western speakers. And there are some reasons to think that makes them effective. All right. Audience participation. She, again, invited the audience to participate. One of the questions I received about this said that in Japan, you're taught that to be an ideal audience member, you should sit perfectly still. And what she did, teaching a few words of sign language, was really only appropriate for an audience of children. That you might ask small children, okay, do it with me now. Today, in the second half of class, when we talk about heuristics, we're going to talk about the consistency heuristic. And if you can get a person to commit to behaving a certain way, even once, you make it a lot more likely that they'll continue. If she had just said in her third point, learning sign language is easy, here are some resources, you should go learn some. What the data tell us is that virtually nobody would go out and do it. But if she demonstrated a couple of very simple signs and everyone did them with her, then at least some people in the audience are likely to remember and use those later, and a few people in the audience are more likely to go and learn more sign language. So that probably is the motivation behind inviting audience participation. Now, one of the questioners asked, does this work in lots of different kinds of speeches? You might recall when we were talking about Kevin and how he picked out an audience member, last week I said, this is a risky, dangerous tactic because the way people react, if you invite them to participate, they might surprise you. If you talk to one audience member, they might not say what you want them to say. If you invite everybody in the room to do something, they might not want to do it, and that can make the room feel very negative. But I can give you one other example from when I was coaching this pretty recently, just a few years ago. I had a student get into the research about the dangers to your health of sitting down for too long. When you sit for too long, there are changes in your metabolism, changes in your lipoproteins, and people who sit all day at their job every day, even if they are very active and athletic, they have an elevated risk of heart disease just from the fact of sitting down a lot. So what this student did, in the first main point of his speech, he explained all of that research. Now, near the end, in the solution point of the speech, he explained a few ways you could remind yourself to stand up at various points of the day. And then, he had a room full of people sitting down, watching him give his speech, and the judge in particular. The judge didn't give a speech, so the judge would just sit for the entire hour. He would say, "Everybody, stand up for a minute," and they all did. And he would say, "Take a couple of steps any direction, and then step back to your seat," and everybody would just do a little bit of this, and they would all sit down again, and he would say, "I probably just added a full day to your life." So, audience participation, if it's well designed, it can be very effective. But if the audience surprises you by not doing what you expect, you have to be very confident and you have to be able to change your tactics quickly. I just realized, is this? Oh, maybe I can't. Oh well, I tried. All right. Beyond audience participation, it was pointed out that at the very beginning of her speech, Emily stated her thesis, and that is uncommon, that what's more common with Japanese speakers is they will lay out all the information and in the summary explain what it means. And I've already said, having a thesis at the beginning of the speech works for Western audiences because of the fact that communication in the West is more direct. You're expected to make your point explicit and then make a case for it. Today, in the second half, when we talk about ways to make your content sticky, ways to make it easy to remember, one of the leading ones is to have a simple thesis statement at the beginning. When you do that, then audiences are more likely to recall other things you say. Emily had an action-based solution. She had the packet that she offered to send to domestic violence shelters around the country, urging them to find interpreters to volunteer. And then also, she taught a little sign language to the audience. And the question was, why is it that American speakers so often have a solution based on action? And the answer is very similar to the point I was making about a thesis. Western audiences expect that because they expect a speaker to be direct, to come right out and say, "This is what I want you to do." As a matter of fact, one of the biggest sources of intercultural difficulty between American businesses and Japanese businesses comes in drawing up the language of contracts. Because Japanese contracts usually define the partnership and the nature of the relationship, but they don't describe what is going to be done. American contracts spell out exactly what will be done, how will it be done, what are the deadlines, what must be delivered. And American companies and Japanese companies will fight endlessly. The American companies say, your contracts are not specific enough. And the Japanese companies will say, but you need to make decisions based on what's happening. You can't write everything down years in advance. Your contracts don't work. And back and forth they go. And I think you could say American audiences wanting to hear action. What specific action is the solution? That's probably just another example of that attitude. Tell us what we're doing. Come right out and say it. And then finally, well, not finally, but one of the questions said that she changed the topic, she would change the subject by pausing. She would get to the end of a major section of her speech and then pause, and then go on to the next thing she talked about. And the questioner said, Japanese speakers will use a conjunction to move to a new subject. Why did she pause? My answer to that is, she didn't necessarily pause to change the subject. She paused as a way of emphasizing what she had just said. She paused so what you had just heard would echo in your head just a little bit, and you might think it over 2 or 3 more times. That's something, when I give a speech, I do a lot. Whatever I think the single most important sentence I will say, whenever I get to that sentence, I get to the end of it, and I go silent for a good 5 to 10 seconds, because I want that to sink in. And I think when she had long pauses, that's what she was doing, not changing the subject, emphasizing. All right, the remaining questions, and there were several, but these are all questions we talked about last week. She opened with a story, and one questioner said, Japanese speakers don't tend to do that. But we talked about capture their attention because Western cultures tend to be speaker responsible. They are more likely to decide that a speaker is boring and then tune them out and think about other things. So you will very commonly see Western speakers start with a story to capture attention. She didn't end with a thank you, and the questioner asked, is it ever okay to say thank you at the end of a speech? I'll tell you, my first public speaking teacher, back when I was 12 years old, she told all of us, never end a speech with thank you. Here was her explanation. She said, if you spent all day cooking a huge meal and then you gave it to people to eat, you wouldn't say, thank you for eating my cooking. They should say, thank you for making the meal. And when you are the speaker and you've worked very hard on researching and writing and rehearsing this speech, and you've presented it to the audience, and it's information that they need to understand, they should thank you. That was her explanation. Now, to answer the question directly, is it ever okay? You will sometimes hear Western speakers for Western audiences end a speech with thank you. It's not necessarily a bad thing. People will not evaluate you negatively if you end with thank you. But I would say the majority of the time, speakers don't end with thank you. I think it's unusual. Walking the triangle, a couple of questioners said she walked around the edges of the room. Japanese speakers tend to stay in one place. And I'll remind you, nonverbal communication research about immediacy, walking up closer to people in the audience to show psychological closeness. That's the reason we teach competitive speakers, don't stay in one place. Don't walk constantly because that's distracting. But on major transitions in the speech, move to a different part of the room and approach someone else. And I guarantee you, school teachers in the United States are taught anytime a student asks a question, walk toward that student while answering, because that shows closeness. There was also mention of no slides. Today's speech that we watch won't have any slides, and we will talk a little bit about the limitations of slides and why they look different in the United States. That's today's lecture in the first half. She was very loud. We talked before about how microphones in rooms even that size are very unusual. There's one point I want to make sure that I've elaborated on in just the right way. You've heard me say before that speaking loudly is a way of conveying assertiveness. Here is my challenge and my encouragement to each of you personally. When you give a speech for a Western audience, they are going to be very, very ready to stereotype you. They're going to be very ready to take Japanese people they've seen in movies and TV shows and think you're just like them. And you're very sweet. And you talk very quietly. And you're very timid. And you're very weak. And I don't think you're weak. I don't think you think you're weak. But they'll think that you are. Because when they've seen Japanese people, specifically Japanese women, TV shows and movies, they're very soft-spoken and very timid and very weak. And you can, if you want, make a first impression that plays right into their stereotype and then have to deal with that afterward and have to prove to them that you're not. You can do that if you want. Or, the first time you meet them, you can take some deep breaths with all the strong muscles in your core, speak boldly and confidently, and watch those Western audiences say, whoa, never seen a Japanese speaker do that, and break their stereotype. My advice to you, don't play into the stereotype, break it. All right, more eye contact. That we talked about previously. When you talk to a Western audience, if you don't have a lot of eye contact, it says to them that you don't believe what you're saying. Lots of direct eye contact is a way to connect. It's a way to keep them interested. It is what they expect. And then finally, in her entire speech, she had 2 jokes. One of them in the first sentence. She said, and his good looks probably didn't hurt either, and that got a laugh. And then in her solution point, she said, and even if it's not perfect, they'll understand you anyway, and that got a laugh. And that was enough to make someone point out she told jokes. 2 weeks ago, we watched informative speaking. She did persuasive speaking. I want to tell you right now what today's event is, because it's a little strange. The name of the event that we will watch today is After Dinner Speaking. Bangohan no ato speaking. Now, why do they call it that? Because an after-dinner speaker is expected to be enjoyable and fun to listen to. So in after-dinner speaking, you should give a speech with research, with a real thesis statement, but all along the way, in supporting and developing your speech, you should tell jokes, and you should be funny. And that's going to be challenging because humor often doesn't translate. And there are a couple of jokes in his speech today that only make sense if you compete in this event. But only a couple. A lot of his jokes, I think you might understand. Let me ask one question. There's an actress who's been around since the 1960s. She was in Mary Poppins, The Sound of Music, The Princess Diaries. Her name is Julie Andrews. Has anyone in here heard of her? Because if you've heard of Julie Andrews, he makes a lot of jokes about Julie Andrews. At least those jokes might be funny. All right. Western speakers do make a lot of jokes. So, that brings us to the end of the debrief on Emily Trader and what she did that looked unusual. What I want to do now is talk a little bit about presentation slides and why they're different. And the first thing I want to do is a demonstration. And after this demonstration, I will explain what research says and how that is a big part of the reason American slides look different. All right. I said before that I teach nonverbal communication. There is a unit on nonverbals involving movement. There are 3 categories of gestures. One category of gestures is called emblems. Emblems. A gesture is an emblem if that gesture has a direct translation to a simple word or phrase. In the United States, this gesture, this means okay. Best translation to Japanese, probably daijobu. In Japanese, or here in Japan, I see this gesture a lot, and the direct translation is forbidden. Can't do it. Can't come over here, can't come in, not open, forbidden. That's an emblem. Adapter gestures are used by the communicator to relieve tension or discomfort. Fidgeting or adjusting clothing are examples of adapters. Some adapters include manipulating an object, while others just involve the hands. This is John Sweller. He's a professor of psychology at the University of New South Wales. And his major contribution, his career's sort of biggest achievement is cognitive load theory. Cognitive load theory. And what he has demonstrated and other researchers have confirmed. What I just did, I told you about emblem gestures with nothing on the screen. I then put up a sentence about illustrator gestures, and I just let you read it, and I didn't say a word. I then read bullet points to you about adapter gestures. This matches experiments he's done. And if I were to quiz you right now on all 3 kinds of gestures, you would do the best on emblems or illustrators and the worst on adapters. Because the regions in your brain that process spoken language and the regions that process language as you read it, they interfere with each other. If I just let you read writing, you can concentrate, process, understand it, and remember it. If I just talk to you, not expecting you to read at the same time, you can listen, understand, process, and remember it. But when I put written language on the screen and I read it, that's the least effective way to deliver content. That is the data-driven explanation behind why you should have minimum text on your presentation slides. There should never be complete sentences, and I mean never. Well, okay, let me back off from never, never, never. I might put one sentence up here if we were going to then discuss that sentence for a whole hour, and we were going to pick it apart and look at individual words if we were going to analyze it. But if all I'm going to do is to deliver to you one sentence of content, then either I should put it on the screen and let you read it, or I should say it to you while there's nothing on the screen. one other researcher whose work sheds a lot of light on this. He has not necessarily done the experiments himself, but he's synthesized a lot of it. His name is John Medina. And John Medina is the strongest advocate of the picture superiority effect. The picture superiority effect. 72 hours after you hear a message, if all you have is the spoken text or the written text, 72 hours later, you'll remember about 10% of it. On the other hand, if you hear an explanation matched with a picture, not words written on the screen, but a picture, then after 72 hours, you don't remember 10%, you remember 65%. You remember more like about 2/3 of it. One experiment replicated a few times. Participants were shown 2,500 pictures, each one for 10 seconds. It was kind of exhausting, but they sat there until they had seen each of 2,500 pictures, 10 seconds each. And then, a week later, they were shown pictures and asked, was this a picture you saw last week or not? And they were 90% accurate. 10 years later, they were more than 50% accurate. Pictures do a lot more to take information and make it recognizable and make it easy to retain. One of the reasons this is true is we know your brain has a limited capacity to decode language and to store it. Those two jobs together, it has one pool of resources. So if you have to work harder to decode the message itself, you're likely to forget it. But if you have to do less work to decode it, you're more likely to remember it. Here's a quick demonstration. I'm going to give you one bit of information 3 different ways, and you think of which of the 3 involves the least decoding. Translating, at least language processing, recognizing. If that's what you show your audience, the amount of decoding is tiny. And the mental resources they have free to retain that part of the content, much bigger. So what are the applications of the picture superiority effect? First of all, this is the reason one of the best applications of presentation slides, one of the best ways to use them, if you have anything involving numbers, anything involving statistics, use a graphic. Use a graphic. Don't use bullet points. Let me show you the ineffective way and then the better way. I might give you a presentation about mental health and overuse, problematic use of phones. And I might say, diagnoses of depression are increasing in the United States. This is true of all groups, but especially young women. There is a correlation with smartphone ownership. And you know, because of cognitive load theory, that you're both trying to listen and read at the same time, and those two tasks are interfering with each other. What I would do instead, I wouldn't do that. I would do this. I would say, these are the numbers of diagnoses of depression over a period of about 20 years. And then I would say, now look what happens in 2011, which is right here. The effect is mildest with teenage boys. The 2012 numbers are actually a little lower than 2009, but then they go up and they keep going up from there. Now that's just teenage boys. Look at teenage girls and look at 2011 and look what happens after. Do you know what happened in 2011? It was the first year in the United States that more than 50% of the population had a smartphone. That's what I would do instead of showing bullet points. I would let you look at the trend and let you understand using a graphic. You might use a pie chart. This is the 2022 budget for the Japanese government. You might use a bar chart to show how many international students there are at various universities. But if you're going to talk about numbers at all, don't put text on bullet points. Use shape, use color, use size to show how do numbers fit together, how do numbers compare with one another, and how do numbers change over time. A second example of the picture superiority effect. Sometimes you want to explain things, how things are spatially located relative to one another. You might do this with a map of Tokyo or with a map of Japan. Now, one limitation, one problem with this visual is it's way too busy. Now, what do I mean by busy? A really effective visual, when you look at it, you should know right where your eye is supposed to go. And there are so many things on this visual, there are different parts you could be looking at. So what I would do, if I were you, and you needed to talk about the layout of this campus, I would show the whole thing, and then I would say, but I want to focus your attention here. And then go in closer. And then you might say, now we're in this building. My office is in this building. A good place to get lunch is here. They have really good karedaisa. And whatever else you needed the audience to know. This, again, is something where they look at shapes. They're not trying to process language with their eyes and their ears. Instead, you're being like a good tour guide. A good tour guide lets people look at what's in front of them, but explains it. And the picture superiority effect tells us that makes the explanation stronger. Let them look at something graphic while you explain what they're looking at. Now, two more points I want to make about that. Sometimes I have students, they might be, let's say, giving a speech about a dog. And so, this will be their visual aid, and they just leave it up the whole time. They talk about dogs. There are a lot of dogs in this country in need of homes. Here is how adoption works in our community. Here are the problems. There are lots of lonely elderly people. And all the while, there's just a picture of a dog behind them. That is not a visual aid. It's only a visual aid when you're talking about it and when you're pointing out details and explaining why they matter. So I might give a speech about dog show competitions, and I might talk about breed standard. So maybe I say the Shiba Inu breed, the standard is these things should be true. Let me define some terms. This part of the dog is called the brisket. These are called the withers. The tail is expected to have this shape. The coat should be deeper here. It should be lighter on the briskets. And I could explain all these things to you without the picture of the dog. But if you've got the dog to look at, and I'm pointing to details, that's a visual aid. The one other thing I should say about that, if it's up the whole time, it'll distract the audience, especially a Western audience. We've said before, Japanese communicators, the culture is listener responsible, which means you are raised, you are enculturated that you should concentrate when someone's speaking because you're responsible for understanding it. Western audiences are not like that. They put the responsibility on the speaker. So if they get distracted, it's your fault because you didn't hold their attention. One implication: don't leave your visual up when you're not talking about it. When it is not directly being discussed, you should make it vanish. It can be very useful in Google Slides to just put a black slide between every slide that has a picture on it, because then you can make the whole thing disappear, and the only thing your audience is looking at is you, and you're not competing with what's coming out of the projector. All right.